Okay, recording is on. So hello everyone. Welcome to the first MuleSoft meetup in Edmonton's area. My name is Jimmy Atia. I'm the strategic advisor with MuleSoft strategy and architecture team. I'm really glad that we are finally here having the first MuleSoft meetup in Edmonton area. This meetup was long awaited since last March, actually. It was supposed to be in person, but due to the pandemic situation, it got delayed many times, but finally we're here. Thanks for joining everyone. Today we are having a very interesting topic on the agenda that actually was requested by many people who attended the last virtual meetup in Calgary. The topic today is error handling and logging best practices for Mule 4. Our main speaker today is Eric Karsted. He is the Director of Technology and the Principal Architect for MuleSoft practice in Bits in Glass. The session will be around 90 minutes, and we will save around 30 minutes for your questions. In a minute, I will switch to Eric to introduce himself and kick off the session. But first, let me go through some meetup logistics. First, as I said, the meetup will be recorded and it will be published to MuleSoft meetup portal afterwards. The meetup attendees will be muted. So if you have any question, please post it in the chat section. I will be watching the chat and collect the questions for Eric, and he will stop a couple of times along the way to take those questions and answer them for you. Also, please note that, and this is actually the interesting part for all of you guys, at 3 points of the presentation, there will be a quiz to test your knowledge on the topic Eric is presenting. So if you know the answer for each one of those questions, please post it in the chat section. The first 3 responders with the correct answers will be announced at the end, and the winners will get 1 training and 1 certification vouchers from MuleSoft. So it's important to pay attention to the content so you can answer the questions correctly. One last note for me. I mentioned this before in the last meetup in Calgary. I really want to make monthly or quarterly cadence for MuleSoft meetups in Alberta and our customers and our partners in Alberta. So please use the chat section to post topics that you would like us to cover in the future meetups. I'm actually building a backlog of topics for the upcoming meetups, and I want to make sure that we are addressing the topics that interest you. So please post the topics that you think you want us to consider in the future. Also, for our customers and partners who are attending today, if you have an interesting topic that you would like to present and share, please contact me. I'm continuously looking for speakers for our meetups. So we welcome everyone to come to the meetups and share their experiences. With that, I will hand it over to Eric to introduce himself and start the session. Eric?
All right,
ready?
thank you.
Yep.
Yes, just give me a moment and I will begin. So Jimmy asked me if I could cover some more in-depth handling of errors, and I wanted to put them in the context of a real-world scenario. So what we're going to be discussing is going to be covering hopefully things that you'll actually use rather than just basics. But we still have to cover the basics. So I will be doing that. We're going to do some more advanced error handling topics, how we can potentially avoid errors. When we do get errors, our redelivery policies and reconnection strategies, and then a summary and some handle your questions. But also, I will be midstream here demonstrating actual Mule applications. After that, we'll cover into logging and then a summary for that and questions. So that's the agenda.
Before you jump into the topic, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, I have a slide for that.
Oh, perfect.
Right. So in addition, there will be the quizzes and goodies, and those will be scattered throughout the presentation. So about myself, I am the Director of Technology at Bits and Glass. I've been in the industry for 36 years and 25 of those years as an architect, with companies like Sun. I was a chief enterprise architect for their global data center practice for 10 years. I was with IBM for 5 years as the industry architect for oil and gas. I've done some large projects with multiple systems, and then most importantly, just came off of a 2-year project for a major airline where they migrated from an in-house mainframe to a cloud service, and that was all about integration. And blah, blah, blah. The integration has been a core part with various different products and including Mule. So what are the goals? What I want to do is demystify error handling in Mule 4. We want to expose some scenarios that you can actually implement. Liberate you with tips to avoid errors. Investigate redelivery policies and reconnection strategies. Verify your work with negative testing. Empower your logging so you can troubleshoot faster, and then recommend a payload logging solution and yeet some goodies. And somebody will figure out why I did these words. So let's talk about the scenario. All 3 activities are going to do the same thing. They are going to insert a record into a MySQL database. But there are 3 entry points. One of them is coming through a web server. One of them is coming from a JMS message queue. And the final one is coming from an inbound file that is from an FTP server. And then there are some notifications and run reports that will be sent out. And why did I cover these? So there is a fair amount of complexity difference in those 3 scenarios. In the synchronous scenario, you have an API specification that you can run against. Generally, you get an error and you pass it up to the calling system. So garbage in, garbage out. The calling system is primarily concerned with validating the data before they send it to you. So they generally have a screen and they do field level validation and make sure they have all the data that they need. And if there's any kind of retries that need to happen, that's on the consumer system or the actual consumer. So yeah, I want to hit the refresh button. With asynchronous coming in through a JMS queue, generally you don't have an API specification. The interface has to handle all the errors. There's no guarantee on the validity of the data, maybe coming from multiple sources. You need to handle retry logic. You need to handle dead messages. And when things go wrong, you need to really notify somebody. With batch, you've got everything from the asyncs column, but you also have to do batch reporting. You know, how many records succeeded, failed. Triggers aren't really an issue, but you need to handle things like partial completion due to system failure in mid-job. And you may need to stage data. So as you go from left to right, the complexity increases and your responsibility for error handling goes up. So let's start from the basics. There's generally two categories, or there are two categories of error messages. System errors, those are thrown by the Mule runtime, and there's nothing you can do about those. And then we have messaging errors. So those are raised by any component within the Mule environment. When an error is raised, an error object is created with a number of fields, right? And those fields are a description, a detailed description, a type, which we will get into later, the cause, potentially a message about the problem, and then potentially child errors. So those are the fields that are provided in the error object, but the most important ones are the type and the description. And generally, if you remember nothing else, what you really want to do is make sure that you are setting your variables for the reason phrase and status code, because that's what's going to be propagated up to calling systems if you set it up correctly in your listener. So that is the error message. Next is that the errors are in a hierarchy, and you can use that hierarchy to handle groups of errors if you know what that hierarchy is. In general, on the left or right, you see the critical, can't do anything about those, but anything under any is going to be handled by the error object. So in the type, you have different namespaces for errors. So on the left, if you have no object within your flow, you're going to have very simple kinds of errors that are available to you. The expression and stream size is what is default. If you have an HTTP requester, then you're going to be able, you're going to see the different HTTP errors that can be thrown. And the same is true for JMS. So if you have a JMS connector, you're going to see JMS errors available to you to be processed. And that goes for other components, the database components and things like that. So which error handler is going to be used? By default, all unhandled messages are logged and propagated by Mule. So if you put no error handling in your application, at the very least, it is going to fail, log a message, and fail all the way up to the top of the subflow. And then it'll start the flow again. And the Mule will map the errors to the response that it sends to the calling system. If you want to handle errors yourself, and generally you do, you're going to have to use an on-error component. And there are two types. There is on-error propagate and on-error continue. And they both behave significantly differently. And they have some similarities. All right. So on-error continue, it will terminate it will execute the on-error scope. So what's within its own scope block. It will terminate the current scope and it will return success to the parent scope. So if you have one flow calling another flow, and within the child flow, you have an on-error continue, it will execute to where it hits an error, handle the error, and then return success to the parent flow so it can continue processing. If you have on-error propagate, it will execute the on-error scope, terminate the current scope, and return the error up to the parent scope. And that parent scope needs to handle the error. It will terminate its flow at that point, and it will do the same thing, propagate it to its parent all the way to the top until something catches it with a non-continue or ends the flow at the beginning. So when you have these on-error scopes, they are local to the scope, and they can get quite verbose. But what you can do is set up global error handlers that share common error processing. So you can reuse your error configuration from one section of your code to the other, and you provide a reference to that error handling flow. So let us start looking at some real world scenarios. So I have a small application here. And it accepts a request. It tries a primary web service to resolve that request. And if it fails, it will set some variables and then propagate continue and continue on with the rest of the flow. So over here, I have a REST client that is going to send the request, and I got back success. But if I look in my console, I received an error, but I did not propagate that up to the calling client. So in my error message in my logging, I see I was calling Google, and I had accidentally put in what I thought about Google into the URL, and it failed as a 404 not found. But I had covered that, and I have an alternate location, which is DuckDuckGo, and it actually resolved my request for me and sent it back. So that is an example of a on error continue. I ended the scope, and in this case, it is a try scope that I can wrap around an individual component that I am thinking is going to cause an error. And in here, for the requester component, I have a error setting where I set up which types I'm going to handle. So if I want to look at everything that I could have handled, you know, from bad gateways all the way to the 13 different HTTP standard errors, as well as the general ones that are for the expression and back streams. So that is what was available to me, but I decided to say the only thing that I can do is if this fails with a not found, I can go and try another website. I could have handled all of these errors, but that was the particular one I chose to handle. All right. In a real world application, so this is the one that is going to handle the execution of the diagram. I implemented it with the API router kit. So in there, you have custom error handling for type API bad request and all the way through. What it doesn't have is an on any. So if you're wondering why certain things are not being handled, it is only going to handle the HTTP requests. I added an on any to simplify some of my message propagation because I'm calling from X to P to S, and I want my errors to flow back correctly. So in here, I have different flows that are doing different things. So I have an error that is, or a flow that's going to retrieve users. I have flows that get user by ID. I have flows that actually, so that's the S flow and some work in the P layer, which is just acting as a proxy between the X and the P. And then updating and inserting into the database. So those are the overall error flows and well, I think I cut out there for a second.
Yeah, we lost you again, Eric. We cannot hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I had a connection issue.
That's okay.
All right. So in this example, we have errors where handlers where we do it at the individual component, and then errors, error handling that may be handled at the component level, and then other errors that I am handling at the flow level. So if I don't handle it within the scope, it will be handled within the error handling of the flow. And then I have this one other component that I'll be discussing later, which is the raise error component. So that is an example of the errors. So what do we do in the transformation? In the transformation, if it is an on-air propagate, you can set a payload that you want to return with the error, as well as you want to set the variables that we discussed, which is HTTP status, and you want to also set the reason code. It's what a normal service would provide you. So that I am getting from the error message and the description. So you're going to want to make sure that in every error handler that you have, that you at least do that as a minimum. Set the two variables. The message is optional and sometimes prevented. So that is just a pretty much quick run through what kind of error handling you're going to have for each of the different components within the scenario that we discussed. And let's swap. So this is the time for the first quiz. What are the two most useful error message fields? The description and cause, the detailed description and type, or the message and cause. And I will give you a moment. All right. So let's talk about some additional error handling topics. Error mapping. So let's say you have two components that do the same thing, that they're sending requests to alternate services that happen in different points in the flow. And you want to have different error responses for service 1 and service 2. You can map errors in that component to actually a different message type or error type, so that in your error handler, you can select it and provide different kinds of information back to the client or handle it differently, so that you don't have just necessarily one HTTP handler. You can map that HTTP type to a custom type and then send that to your error handler. The other component that we briefly discussed is the raise error component. So in my flows, for demonstration purposes, I want to simulate errors. And in that simulation, I can set up, it allows you to set two fields, the message type and a description, and those will be sent to your calling systems. There are some caveats though. You can only do raise core errors or custom errors. You cannot raise errors where there already exists a schema. So no file errors, no JSON invalid schema, no HTTP error. And this is a problem because you think, well, hey, can't I just use this raise error component to raise all the different errors that I'm handling within my environment? And the answer is no. It's unfortunate, but that is the rule. So it is a useful component, but you cannot use it to raise errors that already exist for other components. So some additional things that you need to think about is, what can I update, what's available to me within my error scope, and what can I send out? And there's some differences between the on continue and on propagate. So if you are doing an on continue, the source payload, so what was fed into the component, is not available to you. All right. And in conjunction, you cannot set a payload message. If you are using an on propagate, the information that was the state of your payload prior to the calling component or the erroring component failure is available to you, and you can populate messages and build a new payload and send that off up the error stream. So if you need to access information about the payload on the other side, or in a scope that's going to continue, you're going to need to store the payload in a variable, and then you can access it on the other side of the error. So if I had a triscope, an uncontinue that continued on in that flow, if I wanted to use the payload components, I need to set it to a variable. There is nowhere to set, to access a status code that was provided to you by the erroring system. So if you want to set a status code yourself, you're going to have to figure out what status code to set based on the error type. So if it's a 404, or if it's a HTTP not found, then I need to know I need to set that to a 404. And that's where having global error handlers that do the same thing every single time are useful, right? I've done it once, and then I don't have to do it again. And so the other issue is subflows cannot have error scopes. So if you're using a subflow, you have to wrap the component you want that has an error inside a triscope, and you cannot have a global error handler in that flow to handle everything. Right. So flows can have error handlers, subflows cannot. So we talked about error handling from an error message standpoint and an error propagation and flow control standpoint. But there are other ways of dealing with errors that you have available to you. So we have reconnection strategies. So if you do not establish a reconnection strategy, when your component fails to connect, it will immediately return a connectivity error, and it will propagate to your first error handler. But you can override that behavior. All right. You can either set it at a global configuration, or you can do it within the component itself. So either if it's a database component or a HTTP requester, I can tell that specific one to retry or reconnect. And the one that, you need to do that for, let's say, database connectors. Your service may start before the database server. You may have some network connectivity issues. You want to handle reconnections. All right. So none is the default behavior. And it will just return an error on a connection error. Standard is I will say I am going to try a certain amount of times to connect, at which time, if I exceed that, I will propagate an error for that component. And then The other one is forever. I want to always try and reconnect. Now there are policies to do that, but reconnecting forever is what I usually do for database services. So there are options also for redelivery. So if you, a redelivery policy is going to help you save resources by the number of, limiting the number of times something is going to happen and try and deliver. Again, you can have redelivery at the flow source, or you can establish global policies for messages. And when you have one, it's going to evaluate and execute a number of failed times. So it's not the connection now. I have a connection, but I can't complete the request. I'll try a certain amount of times, and then I am going to fail that particular request. And the error message that it's going to return to you that you're probably going to want to handle is the Mule redelivery exhausted error. All right, and the next time you have a successful delivery, it resets your counter to 0. All right, so you have not, so it's going to clean itself up once I deliver. So that's 2 additional ways of handling errors outside of the error handlers. But what about not causing errors? Right? What about not passing bad data to your systems downstream? So passing clean data to your components will greatly reduce the number of errors that you experience at runtime. And I'm sure everybody knows that, but I am Captain Obvious. So I think it really is worth investing in cleaning, if you can, make sure that the data that you're passing is good. Reject it before you send it downstream and have to deal with errors. So for inbound data on listeners, you want to use all the RAML validation tools at your disposal. You want to make sure you have the field types defined, whether it's required or not. If you have a list of enumerated values that are reasonable in number, 10, 20, then put an enum on your RAML specification. All right. But it's going to only validate enumerated values. Assign default values to missing fields. So somebody makes a request and you need that field and you have a default for it, populate it. For strings, you can do pattern matching so that phone numbers are correct, dates are correct. It's a valid email address. You can set the min and max length for the field so you don't overflow systems down on the other side. For numbers, you can set min and max values, and the format of a number, so the number of decimal places, 0, 4, whatever. And then for arrays, you can guarantee that the items are all unique within the array, so you're not getting duplicates, and minimum and maximum number of items in array. So somebody doesn't send you a batch of 1,000 when you can only process 10 at a time. Now, as we discussed in the initial categorization of the error messages, or the different categories of different patterns, so the async, sync, and batch. One of the things you don't have when you don't have a listening endpoint is the use of the RAML validation. But one of the things I've done for myself is say the values that I have, once I've converted them into the JSON message that I like, I just pass it through an HTTP listener that validates all the data using the RAML validation tools, which are well documented and easy to do, and then spits me right back sorry, I cut out again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. If my headset doesn't hear any sound for for a certain length of time, it turns itself off. And because everybody's on mute, I don't even hear myself
Should I
talking.
beep every couple of seconds, a minute?
Just even if it's just like breathing, that's fine.
Oh,
I'm getting it's sending something, but when everybody's on mute, it goes nothing, and my headset turns off.
yeah, I'll try to breathe every once in a while.
All right.
Good.
So that is a trick that you could use to validate data that's coming from a JMS or an MQ, or coming in from a file, or that you're reading from a database. Next thing is outbound data validation. So even though you have an API spec with a type definition for the data that you're sending back, it is not validated. So Mule only validates inbound. This went on our airline project. We had potentially, I think our largest specification had 2,000, 2,300, somewhere right around there, fields. And to manually check all the data coming back from all these different scenarios was almost impossible. So we built a outbound data validator that we use during development in our dev environment to improve code quality. So, and we built the results of that into our CI/CD pipeline. So if somebody broke the code and we were sending back bad data, we would not promote that code up into our test and QA environments. So it was a really a good way that we could improve our code quality. So that's something that can be done. Another thing that you can do is have an idempotent message validator. So basically that's what is going to make sure that you don't get duplicate messages. So it takes the message, creates a unique key, and then you store it in, let's say, an object store or something like that. So as messages come in, it's going to check and see, is this a unique message? You can create a hash on the message so that you're not storing too much data. And if it does see a duplicate message, so if somebody hits the send twice in a row for a purchase order or something like that, it will throw back a Mule duplicate message error. And then you need to handle it through your errors handling. So the other way to avoid errors is don't have them. And how do I make sure that my code doesn't have errors? I test it. And you want to do negative testing. Most people do happy path testing, but they rarely test all the different error subflows and code that you wrote. And like I said, you're writing a lot of data weave and setting variables in those error handlers. So you want to make sure you can test them wherever possible. So remember I said the raise error can't throw an error message that is used by someone in the schema. What you can do is build a dummy service. And one of the things that you have your application pass to it is the error message that you want it to throw. So it's just going to take whatever you send it. It's going to look at the error message and throw back the error that it requested. And now you can test your subflow or your error handling. And it doesn't take very long to do that. In addition, do your M units to do negative testing. Everybody hates doing M units, but there is a recorder in Studio that can allow you to exercise your code and build those M units fairly easily. Next thing is end-to-end testing. So a lot of people test in their development environment and their dev, but make sure that you're actually getting data from the services that you're calling so that unexpected things happen and you're handling it early before things go into production. You want to maintain consistency between your environments from dev to prod. You know, one of the problems that we had was the messaging in production was MQ, but our messaging in development was SOLAS. So when we actually went into production, there were things that MQ was sending back to us that SOLAS didn't. All right, so that is something to be wary of. And then make sure you test with Postman, SoapUI, Advanced REST Client, and then take those tests that you built in your unit testing and build yourself a regression suite with them that you run when you promote code to dev, to QA, and non-update ones in prod so that you can simulate errors and or test your code fully every single time where you can. That saved us a lot of problems and reduced our regressions in code by a major factor. So test your code, and then test the negative flows so that your error handlers are behaving the way you expect them to. So our next quiz is here upon us. And the question is, what can't be validated with RAML? Whether something is required or not, values for a field, string patterns, or unique items in an array. And we will give you a moment for that. So, summary. Error handling takes a lot of time and thought. So you should budget at least 30% of your development effort for of something that's of substantial complexity, right? Not just I'm going to go and hit an endpoint and return a value, but something that has actually more business logic. I'm dealing with multiple data sources. I'm dealing with parallel execution of requests to improve performance, those kinds of things. So about 30% is a good chunk of your development time is dealing with errors. And if you are actually handling business logic errors within there, you're going to have to increase that. You want to handle errors for every major interaction with components and systems, and then let the default error handlers take care of the rest, because you probably can't do anything about that error anyway. It's probably a code error. You've got a data weave error or something like that. Validate your data and test your handling routines. And then use reasonable reconnect and redelivery policies. 2 isn't enough. Never is probably too much. And at this point, we want to take some questions.
I have captured some questions, Eric. Maybe I can read them for you.
Sure.
You want? So the first one is a question: whether the raise error component will be used in real time by any chance. So basically, what are the use cases to use the raise error component?
All right. So I just mentioned business logic errors. All right. So let's say I have something that comes to me and I couldn't validate it with the RAML validation. So an example is you need to be at least 16 to get a driver's license. And let's say somebody comes in at data comes in at 15. It's valid data, but it's incorrect from a business logic standpoint. So what I would do in there is raise an error of business : underage, and then I would let my error handler handle it, write up a message that says, hey, your request for driver's license is invalid because you are too young. and send that up. So they did not get success, they got an error. And it was a business logic error.
Yeah,
And
perfect.
the error code I would put is generally 400, which is bad request.
Yeah, as a user error.
As a yes.
Yeah, right, perfect. You want to take the second one? Second one is from a tool. He's saying, if I make an analogy with Java exception handling, is it is this right to say that on error propagate equals rethrow exception, and on error continue equals catch exception and log it?
No. And especially true for Propagate, because it with Java, you're generally not modifying the error, and you can completely remodify the error with Propagate by changing messages and handling different messages at a higher level than you would at a lower level. So it's so similar, but executed differently. Right?
Yeah. Okay, good. Next one, how to identify transient errors. Is there separate error type to identify?
So I am unsure what you mean from a transient error,
Yeah, so
but
that,
I really, um, you know, either you've got system errors, code errors that are going to fail, or data um, errors that are coming from a service that you're calling. Um,
so
those are the errors that
he's
you can deal with.
so Rajesh should put a follow-up. He means connectivity errors, like database not available or something like this.
Right. So that was where, you know, if I go back a couple of slides. So your reconnection strategy is to handle connectivity errors, and your redelivery policies can handle resending of errors where I don't have a connection, right? So that's where you address intermittent errors. And so for the connectivity specifically, for databases, I always try to reconnect forever, because hopefully that database that's getting patched for the next 5 hours will come back, but it's not something short, right? So some things I will reconnect, you know, maybe for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Otherwise, I'm probably going to want to try and reconnect forever.
But in this case, Eric, wouldn't the API like kind of raise timeout or something like this if this is being called from a higher level API, like a process API calling a system API that is taking forever to connect to a database?
It will.
Mm-hmm.
It will, but you want your service to eventually reconnect to the services that it needs to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that error will time out if let's say it came from a user, right? So yeah, he timed out. But remember, I've still got my batch service and my asynchronous service
Yes.
continually sending messages, and when it can't deliver, it just doesn't pull it from the queue, and then it's got a resend, a retry configuration that says, hey, if I can't send it, if I get an error back because of connectivity, wait a minute, and then the next time wait 5 minutes, and then the next. So in your retry strategies for those things, you handle that condition. But I eventually need my database to reconnect.
Yeah, perfect. Let's move on. Next question should be easy. What is the default behavior of error handling? Is it on error propagate or on error continue?
On error propagate. So if you do nothing, it will propagate all the way to the top. The base Mule error handler will handle it, set the status, set the reason phrase, and ship it to whoever was calling it.
Yeah. Right. Next one, why connection strategy doesn't work for some connectors? For example, Microsoft Dynamics connector, we had to use until successful for that connector. So I'm not sure if you're
I am
familiar with.
not familiar with the Microsoft
Yeah.
the dynamic. Generally, it is implementation specific. So if the connector is handling the reconnections, it may not allow you to change whatever information is, or Microsoft Dynamics may not like it. Right?
Yeah.
So that is, or it's not really a connection, right? It's really, behind the covers, it's an HTTP service and you don't really have a connection. So you have to do until success scope.
Correct. I have a couple of more questions, but maybe we can keep them until later. So I want to give you enough time to go through the slides and if there is any other extension for the demo.
It's a pretty dense topic. I hope I didn't bore you to tears with an hour of error handling, but it is absolutely critical to getting quality production code. So in conjunction, this leads to the next topic, which is logging, right? I'm having errors if it's an end user system and I'm just handing them on. I'm not going to receive notifications that those errors are happening. So how do I find out? What is my system doing? How can I figure out what went wrong? And what were the conditions at the time of the error? What information do I need in development for developing testing? And what do I need in production? It may be different. And for eternity, logging has been the number one go-to solution for providing this information. And I don't see that change in the future. How we handle logs, where we send logs is changing, but you're still going to want to log data because let's say you lose all network connectivity. You've got no systems that you can send data to. You've just got your local log. So every app that you build with Studio has its own log4j XML file where you can configure logging. The logging contains information, the logs contain information about any errors that are raised by the application. Unless you have app logic to handle those errors, and that's a caveat. So Mule will do some things for you if you don't handle the error. So it's going to go all the way up to the top, do its error handling and logging, and you're done. If you have an on continue, the only thing that's going to get logged in your logs is what you log within that on continue scope for that error. Because remember, on continue, you leave the scope with success. So Mule will never see that error. So make sure you log what you need to log.
So Eric, if you can elaborate a little bit about the right and the elements that developers need to take care when they do logging. So if they catch an error, what do you need to log and what you
I've
shouldn't
got
log?
that in the next slide.
Perfect. Yeah, sorry.
All right. So, and how do you do it? You use the logger. It was probably the first thing that you used in Mule when you did your Hello World app. You probably logged something. But so where should I log in my flows that aren't error related? Right. So you want to log at the start and end of every flow. Right. And then you want to log at the start and end of a big piece of code logic. So maybe in a subflow, if you took that code logic into a subflow, that's a good division. So I'm going to log start and end of that. If I have transformations that are complex, I may want to log some information before and after the transformation to help debug stuff. And then you definitely want to log before and after any external system. So before you do your database call and after you do your database call, before you do your HTTP request, after, before I read a JMS message and after, before I read a file and after, right? So those are the real key locations where you want to log information about your flows. You can use log categories and you can use log levels. So you want to make sure that in your logging, you don't log everything as debug. So it goes up in priority of what gets logged for different environments. So you may have debug logging enabled and log certain very specific pieces of data with debug or informational messages. So it runs the gamut, but everybody should have already done with that. And then you can group things into logging categories as well, right? And so the next question is, what should I log, right? I want to log a minimum about my Mule application. So name of the application, the flow I'm in, the worker, the standard kinds of things that you see in most Mule messages, right? So remember that errors on continue aren't going to get passed up and handled by the Mule logger, so you're not going to see that information. So if you need additional information in that, you need to log it. You want to make sure, for every application or every transaction, what I'm going to have a inbound transaction ID. All right. I'm going to want to log the end-to-end correlation ID. So your entry point into your API network, it's going to come in unassigned, And your first Mule app, so typically your X app, is going to log that or set that correlation ID right at the beginning of your flow. And then you are going to want to pass that to every application within your networks. So from X to P and from P to S, right? And then when it sends it back, it will also send it up the chain. So that is the one of the key fields that you need to log. You need to set a correlation ID for your end-to-end flow, and you need to pass it to every system in your environment, in your API network. And then if I get external transaction IDs back, so either somebody is tracing through those, their system. So let's say I had business group A, which are my XP and S applications, and then there's business group B, also within your company, and they have their own XP and S. So they are, whoever initiates the transaction at the very beginning, he may set his correlation flow and send it to you. And then when you're calling through and passing it down and you call Salesforce and you do something, Salesforce is going to give you back a transaction ID that they can use to help troubleshoot their problems. So you're going to want to pass that back up the chain and log it. Other things that are really useful to help me troubleshoot problems is I want to start a counter at the beginning of my flow, and or start and end logs that we discussed here, the before and afters and start and ends. And I want to log the lapse time between start and end. All right. So if I have a start and end flow, I want to start the counter at the beginning of the flow, calculate the lapse time, and log it with my end flow log record. And then any other key data that you think you need to troubleshoot a problem. So if you are trying to troubleshoot uh, a request and your system that you're calling is sending you back an error, and all they send you back is the status code and the reason code, how do we figure out, well, what caused the problem? So I need to be able to log, the information sufficient to potentially recreate that error situation so I can troubleshoot it. So that's what I said. What to log is subjective. There's some highly recommended or must, the Mule application information, highly recommended, the inbound transaction ID, your correlation ID through your internal, where you're going to figure out what happened in XP and S, the external transaction IDs, and then some data about the message. You may get a record not found. Maybe so it would be good to log the key for that record so somebody can go and look it up and say why did this record with this key that I sent to Salesforce not be found. Right? And then we already talked about using log levels and categories. But Mule's logger is ugly. The format of the messages is terrible. I mean, it is 1960s. Maybe 1970s. All right. So it works, but it's difficult to deal with. you have to set all these variables internally and track them and make sure they get cleared on error conditions so that something else doesn't show up with an error. We had one situation where we were not propagating an error correctly during recursive calls, and it thought it had an error when it didn't, and it went to the parent again and started walking the tree, and it just got in an infinite loop. And as the requests were coming in, our CPU utilization just continued to grow and grow because these threads never ended, because we didn't have a retry timeout. So that is some tricky things. And it was because the logging and the error handling wasn't capturing the information that we needed. But to the rescue, there is this component offering which will log your messages out using JSON. So it's the JSON logger module. The author is Andreas Ramirez. I suspect he works for Mule, or at least he did when he wrote the components and the articles. And it is a replacement logger for your application. So your log component, wherever you use that, it would replace that. It does some interesting stuff, right? Now, how you use it, basically you want to set up the configuration of your JSON schema. So it's pretty flexible. It uses the SDK to build a component that you include in your Anypoint Studio. You install it, and then it shows up in your palette, and now you have a JSON logger. It is very nice. It does some things that we talked about. There are the links to go look at his initial article, which was the JSON logging Mule 4, or the first one actually was, and it's been updated, and he has an article with additional information. So I didn't want to cover and plagiarize his work. I want to make you aware of it. We had started at Bits and Glass building our own JSON logger module like this. But when we found it here, we said, nope. So we are currently, at least all our internal projects, now using the JSON logger module. So what does it look like? Well, it gives you the information that I talked about. Your application name, version, environment, timestamp, root correlation ID, the threads, the priority of the log, and that this was a trace point start. And then another example was, okay, this is a trace point after API or backend call. So within the flow. And then the last example here on the right is, it is the end info, and it already calculates and logs the elapsed time. All right. And then, as with anything, it still gives the ability to put your own message there and log what you have currently available in your standard Mule logger. So good stuff. A little bit of effort to get going with it. You'd have to set up that schema and have the component replaced in your code, but you can do some of that with scripting. Right. So what you could do is look for every instance of your logger in your XML. Look at the XML section for the message setup and create new XML with the new JSON logger. Probably read a DataWeave script to do that. So that is the JSON logger. Good stuff, worth the time to look at it. Above and beyond logging, when you're not dealing with an end user or a system that's in somebody else's data center, when things go wrong, you're going to need to notify people. Standard way to notify people is an email message, sending something off to a pager, though I don't know who has a pager anymore, but maybe a text message. And you want in your on-air scopes to do the notifications where you think you really need them. So you don't want to log on all the errors, but if your retry or connection has gone over an hour, maybe somebody needs to be notified and you want to send a notification. So email, text messages, legacy pagers. You could also automatically talk to some trouble ticketing systems like ServiceNow or Ops Genie through email messages or text messages. So when you do this, sure you get it right. There have been companies that didn't do their notification right, flooded emails, were treated as a spammer and blacklisted from the receiving services. And if they blacklist your IP and it's an internal IP, I have seen companies mail get blacklisted for themselves. So careful. And then generally creating the email, figuring out when I want to send it is not that hard generally in the code. Once I know that, I'm going to send it to an email service. It's a simple call. The hardest part is getting a list of interested parties who can do something about those notifications and is willing to step up and say, yes, I'll be responsible for dealing with these notifications. That, above and beyond the code, is the toughest part. So don't wait till your end of your project to address this issue. It could take months to get resolved. Is it going to be internal? Is it going to be the business unit? Is it going to be our service provider? You know, they're going to charge us more if we send them more than 10 notifications a month. So that is the hard part. You have to do it. start early. So another thing that you may want to log is a payload. And I'm talking about not just the error message payloads, though that is a possibility, but every single payload that's coming into your system and being sent out. All right. But, and you need this sometimes to troubleshoot problems. There's just no other way. I need the full payload. MuleSoft doesn't provide a mechanism to persist. So there's nothing in the Cloud Hub to store data. The only thing they store is your logs, and those are on a retention policy. Hello?
Hey,
My headset's
sorry, I should have
shut off
moved
again.
noise.
Anyways, so MuleSoft doesn't provide this mechanism. They don't persist customer data, right? So MuleSoft logs are not the answer to do this, right? They truncate large messages. There's no guarantee that log messages will be persisted at high volume rates. That's what they say in the documentation. I've never experienced it, and I've run 1,000 transactions a second, and I had logging on, and then I went into debug mode. I tried to get it to lose messages, but I couldn't. But your mileage may vary. The conditions may be different, and there's no guarantee that what you put in a logger is actually going to make it into the Mule logs. And then when you start logging data and payloads, you are going to start filling your logs with spam. They're going to have, it will become noise, and finding real problems will be harder. It's going to fill up your logs faster. You get 100 megabytes and or 30 days retention, whichever is the greater of the two. So it'll retain your logs for 30 days, or if you exceed 100 megabytes in your logs, it will start rolling off your older logs. So if you're filling it up really quickly, you may have 2 days of retention. So yeah, is data privacy. Oops. Yeah, in that if you're logging payloads, has somebody done a data classification on the data? Are you making sure that you're not violating some privacy regulation? Are you complying with HIPAA? If you get any medical data, it's probably not. Credit card data, personal information in Europe. So if you got any Europeans in your system, coming through your system, you have GDPR requirements that exceed North America. So you don't want that in your logs, because your logs are available to anybody that you grant access to monitor and troubleshoot. So you're probably going to need to roll your own. We at Bits and Glass have built a payload logging solution that uses JMS to asynchronously move messages to a data store of choice. And the messages that we're logging, we're providing metadata, a section where you can put clear text, and then if you need to, a section where you can encrypt the data. So the logs encrypt the data with the public key, and only people who have access to the private key can pull it from the data store and view it. This was for a healthcare application where complex integrations, they just couldn't figure out why some things were happening, but they needed to make sure that they didn't put anything in a log or just stuff it in a database. Putting in a database directly had too much overhead and was slowing stuff down. So we have something like that. You can roll your own, or you can talk to somebody in sales. So question number 3, and I think we're doing good. I'm sorry, a few minutes late, which is, so which of these is optional for logging? Transformations, start and end of a flow, before and after a connector, the on error scope. Again, fairly straightforward. So, logging summary. So logging is necessary. So modern tooling like the JSON logging can make your job easier and provide you better information, make it more readable, make everybody's life happy. So I highly recommend looking into that. And then this next line, I need you to say 10 times really fast. Notify those in the need to know with notifications. And then if payload logging is required, there are options, but there's nothing out of the box. And questions?
Yeah, I have captured a few questions, so I'm gonna take them in order so I don't miss anyone. A question, if we get error in navigate to experience, he says, I mean, follow reference and HTTP requester work the same? Am I audible?
No. Yes.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah.
My
Yes.
voice is audible, or you got the question?
You are audible. Can you hear me? Can you
So,
hear me?
yes. I was reading the question. Did you get it, or I should read
Yes,
it again?
yes, I did. Okay.
Okay.
So absolutely not. All right. So remember the two things that your component is going to return. That's the status code and the reason code. So you need to set those. And then if you need to provide information to your calling application, you need to set that in a payload. And so generally what I do is for every request and response, as part of the message definition, I put an array of errors so that when I'm getting data back from a system, let's say my P, it will populate that array of errors, and then that's going to be sent back as part of the payload, or from the S to the P, and then it's going to do its own thing and add to that array of error messages. And then again, it only gets to send back guaranteed the status code and a single string for reason code. Right. So that's That's all you're guaranteed. So if you don't go in and in your error handlers, insert that information into the error, the payload, it's gone.
So basically, you're saying, Eric, that if an error was raised in the system API, in order to traverse the whole tree, going through the process API and then experience API, and then to the caller application or the end consumer, you're saying you need to build an array all the way, right?
Yes, you need to put it as part of your message. And if you want to just have more than one, then you need to build an array of messages. So let me go and take a look here. See if in my console, no. So let me take, do I have an error? Didn't have an error compiled before. Let me stop the application and let me restart this application. And I will show you an example of what happens. All right. Okay, so my application is deployed. So I have the API console here. I need a sorry. Let me set a reason code here, or an error that I know is not going to create an error. And I'm sending it.
I think there is a breakpoint. Is that a breakpoint? No.
Did I start the right application is the question. I started the wrong application, sorry. So, and stop. Here. I have an error in my application, but I don't see. Transform. That's all right. I'm not going to call that one anyway. Did console. So it did deploy it. Now I'm going to send this again. So I have this the code here that is sending back an error. All right, and it's being propagated from P to X, and it's telling me that there was an HTTP error, and it's a 500. But
does the user need to understand the complexity of the 3 layers, Eric? If the caller is like...
but the developer does.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, these messages are here to help the developers troubleshoot the problem. Like when you get your Microsoft window blue screen of death, can you read anything? No. but here's the point. The problem happened in the S layer. All right. And my error message is completely different in the S layer. All right. It was a Mule transformation error being caused by this transformation. And in my error handling, I did not have an on propagate. I don't have an on propagate for this error message. So it's not going to go in and set the reason code and the correct status code. It's just going to go and fall to a 500, which is the default on my listener. So if it's not set, I send back 500, and P says, "Oh, you gave me a 500, so it's going to go in and log in its messages. See, HTTP server, and that was it. Right? I did pass back. That was it. So
Yeah.
it's a failed, but I don't have my propagation 100% correct here in my error handling in this demo.
Yeah, that's okay. So I want to be mindful of time. We have 8 minutes left. I want to make sure that we go through the winners of the 3 quizzes that we had.
Stop
Do
sharing?
you want to pull them? Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Give me a second. I need to pull up the correct screen. As you can imagine, I have multiple screens open to do demos.
Yeah. Until you open the right screen, I want to encourage everyone of the attendees before we wrap up. Please post in the chat section the topics that you would like to see us presenting in the future meetups. I will be collecting those ones and add them to the backlog. Thank you.
All right. Where's the winners?
So if you can pull up the question, I can announce the winner. So the
Okay.
question one was, what are the 2 most useful error message fields? And the right answer was number 3, the description and type. And the winner for that question is Harinatha Kasiridi. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. So congratulations. Next question. You had something for the second one, Eric. Do you want to pull it up? Question. Quiz. Like it was on the slides. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. So yes. Here we go. And let me flip to. Oops. Huh. Oop.
Yeah, that one. You want to read this one? Oop. Yeah, the one that you showed.
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you wanna say something in here? Do you wanna read the question and the answer?
So, what can't be validated with REBEL? And the answer is values.
Yeah.
All right.
And the winner for that question is Abhishek Bethwell. Congratulations. So, Eric, in this one, we have received lots of responders to number 4. Can you please speak a little bit why number 4 is not the right answer?
Yes. So in RAML validation, you have 4 arrays. You can validate that everything is a unique item in the array. That is available to you for RAML validation.
Perfect.
So I can say how minimum, maximum number of records in an array, and I can enforce that every item in that array is unique.
Great. Again, the winner is Abhishek Bethwal. Let's move to the last one. Yeah.
Yep.
Go back one slide.
Oh, jeez.
Yep. So which of these is optional for logging? And the right answer is
number 1, transformation.
Number 1, transformation. So, and the winner is Kishan Nali Gerla. Congratulations, Kishan. Yeah, so the winners, I will send the winners to the Meetup admin team, and they will receive a message from MuleSoft team to show you the next steps to get your prizes. Again, the prizes will be 1 voucher for a training and 1 voucher for certification. I have not received any suggestions for future topics, so we have 4 minutes left. I encourage everyone to drop me something. And until then, like Eric, do you have any final thoughts? Thank you very much. It was really interesting topic. I think it's really, really helpful. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, other than this is where I'm at. If you want to find us, we've done close to 200 MuleSoft projects and lots of happy customers. And that's about it. Thank you very much. I know it's kind of dry topic, and I appreciate your guys' patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, and hope we see you soon again in future meetups. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.